Hey guys, and welcome to video 3 for chapter 24. And for this one, we're going to be talking about the economic system known as capitalism. Now, capitalism has its roots in Western Europe. Western Europe saw a rapid expansion of both population and economic size during the 17th century, right? So we're talking about the 1600s, a little bit before, the Americas really start to come around. This resulted in the development of an economic system known as capitalism, this expansion in both population and economy. Capitalism had a profound impact on the growing power of Western nations, and it's still the dominant Western economic system today. Now, to find out how it got to this status, let's first discuss the beginnings of capitalism. Now, the foundation of European economic expansion was mostly due to a rapid population growth. Okay, you look at the chart. Once you started to hit 1500, you saw Western Europe really started to go skyrocket, much quicker than the other regions. You notice there is no U.S. up until the 1700s, so that one almost doesn't count. But Japan, China, India, these countries that we think of as being very heavily populated today, they were not rising at the same rate as Western Europe in the 1500s. Now, this rapid expansion in overall people, it wasn't necessarily due to rising birth rates as it was to better nutrition and decreasing mortality. Now, the better nutrition was largely the result of food crops from America being introduced to Europe due to the Columbian Exchange, like we talked about in a previous video. It was also due to a sharp decrease in plague outbreaks. Right? The whole Black Death, bubonic plagues, they had gotten those under control. These things had decimated Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, and you just weren't really seeing them by the 16 and 1700s anymore. Also, while European countries were still at war in the 1700s, you didn't see a ton of war on the continent of Europe itself, meaning less civilian casualties. So, as we mentioned numerous times in numerous parts of the world, when population levels rise, it always results in urbanization. Now, you notice some things with urbanization, even though it doesn't list all that many. You look at some of the capital cities. You got London, you got Paris, you got Madrid, you got all of the Italian ones, you got Berlin, right? You got Copenhagen up here. Once you go outside of Western Europe, you got Warsaw, you got Budapest. You really don't have much going in Eastern Europe. And while Moscow is up there, even though it's not technically on this map, you didn't have much going on in Russia either. Most of your urbanization was happening in Western Europe. Okay, you did not have as much going on in Eastern Europe and Russia. And urbanization, it's an important part of capitalism because trade and banking systems flourish in cities. So let's get into the nature of capitalism. More people, bigger cities, it contributes to capitalism. But what is capitalism about? All right, probably the most important term of capitalism is free markets. In capitalism, private parties make their goods available on a free market. When I say free, in varying degrees, it's free from government control. These parties compete for the largest share of the free market, thereby earning the largest profit. All right, so it's all about competition. It's about profit. They also make all of their own decisions, such as who to hire, what to produce, how to sell it, etc. Very, very strict government-free capitalism is known as laissez-faire capitalism. So the desire for profit and owning your own business, that was nothing new. People wanted to make money going back to ancient times, and you had business owners in ancient and classical times. But European merchants in this era built business networks, large business networks, based on the idea of supply and demand. Now, Adam Smith, who was a Scottish economist, and philosopher, first came up with this notion that the market dictates what will be sold. Right? If people demand something, people are going to supply it. Now, international trade opened up demand for a vast array of goods and products, between Middle East and Europe, the Americas in Europe, the Far East in Europe. So you got all sorts of new demands going on in Europe now. Excuse me. And the more intuitive, cunning, and sometimes just plain out lucky merchants were able to best take advantage of these demands to build very, very successful networks over multiple continents. Capitalism rests on the notion of private rather than government ownership. But right from the get-go, there was a strong relationship between capitalism and empire. European governments were not ignorant of what these companies were up to, right? these companies that were going out and setting up shop in India and South America and the Far East and all over the place. But they felt it in their best interest to take a more hands-off approach. I remember we talked about with laissez-faire. That way, everyone benefited, minus the poor workers, the indigenous people, slaves, but, who cares about them as long as they're rich or getting wealthy. England and the Dutch Republic in particular created very favorable environments for companies. They allowed what we talked about in a previous video, joint stock companies. All right, you got the VOC for the Dutch or the English East India Company. They allowed these companies to create their own charters and authorize these companies to explore and conquer far-off areas. Kind of as precursors to outright military conquest. Now, overall, capitalism is about competition, which put it at odds with older business practices such as guilds. Guilds were designed to protect workers by limiting membership and production. You wanted to make sure that the workers in the guild didn't have a lot of competition because then they could be paid better. Capitalism is about the opposite of that. Flooding the market with competitive goods and let the consumer decide. Don't allow the guilds to kind of stranglehold everything. This competitive nature, it hurt the guild system the same way that, unions and capitalism can be at odds even today. But it also led to certain innovations, such as the putting out system. Now, business owners did not want to deal with guild interference in the cities. So what they did was they moved production to the countryside. And out here, the raw materials, so you've got the merchant bringing the cotton into the villages and towns, and the workers, right here you've got the spinners' cottages, and there you've got the weavers' cottages, and then the finished cloth would be taken back by the merchant into the town or shipped off wherever, and that would complete the whole cycle for it. This would remain a very common system of production up until the 1800s, when industrialization would make it obsolete. All right, so let's get into, I did not put the title up here. All right, so for this one, just write, kind of as a title for this slide, Capitalism's Effect on Society. Now, capitalism isn't just about buying and selling. Economics has a profound impact on society. For instance, it resulted in an increased standard of living in Western Europe. Now, again, make sure you put Western Europe in there when you're taking these notes down. This was really mostly for the upper class, as you can imagine. Wealth tends to benefit the wealthy. But it did trickle down a little bit to the peasants. They had more material goods than they did before. But the wealth distribution was also not equal throughout the regions of Europe, as I mentioned before. Capitalism was mostly taking hold in Western Europe. Eastern Europe and Russia, they had less cities, and they were stuck in more medieval systems such as serfdom. Okay, the vast majority of Russia's population would remain in serfdom up until 1900s. They wouldn't abolish serfdom into the 20th century. Additionally, besides you've got this kind of disparity between wealthy and poor, capitalism also poses some very significant moral challenges. Medieval theologians thought profit-seeking was morally dangerous. Right? You wanted to work for the greater good. Christ himself urges us to give up our material wealth. So this led to economic philosophers such as Adam Smith looking to justify the profit-driven nature of capitalism. Smith wrote that society would prosper if people sought their own economic interest. You look at his quote here. It's not from the benevolence, meaning the good nature of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we expect our dinner. It's from the regard to their own interests. They sell this stuff so they can make money. It's not because they want to supply us with meat, beer, and bread. They're not doing it for free. They're doing it so we can buy their products and then they can succeed economically. So he says, really, it's for the best of everybody. Nevertheless, though, the image of capitalism being selfish and only about personal gain, it resulted in some deep social strains that we still see to this day. One other local but significant change was the emergence of the nuclear family. Now, when we're talking about the nuclear family, we're talking about The Simpsons. Mom, dad, 2.5 kids, right? A couple of pets, that type of thing. Capitalism allowed families to be independently wealthy. So you saw less large extended families that you still see in some of the developing parts of the world, such as India and Africa and so forth. Kind of focusing on smaller numbers, it also led to love being a stronger consideration for marriage and couples feeling less inclined to have as many kids. They were much more content settling for 2 or 3 kids as opposed to figuring, well, we need as many kids, and especially male kids, as possible because we need them to work on the farms. All right, so that was a video on capitalism, and then we'll we'll have the next video, which will be on the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment.